goodness, can you imagine if I did this without a cup of coffee in my hands I never got the chance to drink? See if I'm actually live. There we go. Good morning, guys. This is kind of a happy day, but kind of a sad one because we are on our very last chapter of Breadcrumbs. We're on chapter 25 already, and you can see we're just a whisper away from the end. Finer than a frog's hair, the number of pages we've got left. We are so close to finishing. So I want to take a moment to remember some of the awesome stuff that happened in this book. If you've got any favorite moments, you can always leave them in the chat if you're watching live, or you can leave them in the comments if you're watching later. Goodness, I think one of my favorite moments in the whole book was when Hazel was taken in by Nina and Lucas after the market when she got really scared, and they pulled her away from that wizard. I think my favorite moment was when I saw that mechanical bird, and I started to put the pieces together in my head of how the author had been foreshadowing when she said that, for example, Ben's sister was turned into a bird by a couple who had wanted to keep them. When I saw that mechanical bird and I heard Nina and Lucas talking about how they used to have girls that they took care of and how somebody had gotten away and wasn't safe anymore, according to them, that made me think something spooky's going on here. Absolutely something is happening. Just a little personal note. So, think for you, what were those moments that you really savored? As we dive back into chapter 25, Jack has just noticed Hazel, so I'm going to reread the last paragraph of chapter 24 just to give us a heads up. Hazel shook her head. She was crying now, and the tears burned at her scar and bit at her face. My dad left, and I didn't know what to do, and you came over, and... Hazel dissolved. The words flew away. There was nothing. Jack looked down at the ball and squeezed it. He turned it around in his hands again. And then he looked up and blinked. Hazel? Chapter 25, Hazel in the Woods. Jack? He was squeezing the ball in one hand and staring at her. He was shuddering harder now, and his skin shone as if he were sweating. She couldn't move. She couldn't do anything but let the tears run down her cheeks and stare back at him, willing him back to her. Hazel, he repeated, like her name was a revelation. He blinked at her. I gave you this. Yes. He looked at the ball again and then at her. I'm really cold. I know, she said. She inhaled and her stomach contracted. Jack, she said, we can go somewhere warmer. Would you like that? He blinked at her. Yeah, he said. Okay, she said, and it was the only word she could say. She crouched down next to Jack and put her arm around him. He was wet and so cold he felt wrong to her, and she had to work to suppress a shudder. Hazel wrapped both arms around him and pulled him into her. She'd never realized how skinny he was, but that was Jack. He burned off energy just by being alive. He shivered and shuddered, and she tucked him into herself, though she was a very small girl. I am warm, she thought. I am warm, and I am getting warmer. I am gathering all the warmth of my body, all of the Hazel's past and future, and I'm giving it to you. She held him like that, willing him to leach warmth from her, willing his body to learn from the rhythm of her heartbeat, the steadiness of her breath. Then the ground beneath them cracked. The sound hit the air like a slap. Freezing water crept onto Hazel's legs. Hazel looked up. The ice floe they were on had split. Winter as dark and sickly as the storm-tossed sky seeped onto their perch. Jack, she whispered, we have to go. Come on. She was trying her best to sound brave and in control because she was the one whose heart knew how to beat and lungs knew how to breathe and legs knew how to walk, and that passed for heroism now. Hazel wiped her face and stood up, pulling Jack with her. His legs sank and she gasped and pulled him back up. Can you walk? She whispered, her heart squeezing. He inhaled. I think so, he said. He drew himself up, clutching the baseball in his hand, with Hazel supporting him. The shift in weight caused the ice floe to dip into the black water, and Jack fell back down. Water splashed on him, and he flinched. The floe was melting. Hazel's eyes snapped to the lake. Around them, the black water was stealthily infiltrating the ice. "Come on," she said, tugging him up again. With one arm on Jack's back and another supporting his chest, Hazel pushed him forward. The palace loomed east of them, but to the west was a line of trees, the woods calling her back. "This way," she said. They stepped from Jack's flow to the next one. Jack inhaled and looked behind him. "What?" she said, turning to look. Jack's flow had cracked into Jack's flow had cracked into 4 pieces now. "Nothing," he said, his eyes on the ice behind him. "Come on." Hazel could feel the water beneath their feet rocking, roused like an awakening beast. The patch of ice rocked with it, and Hazel struggled to keep them both standing. Water lapped at their perch. The next flow was a giant step away. "We'll go at the same time," she whispered to Jack. "Ready?" "Hazel," he said. "It's okay, Jack," she said. "Hazel!" She looked up. Jack was staring off to the right. She followed his gaze and then sucked in a breath. The palace loomed there watchfully. It was not alone. Standing in front of it, just before the shore of the lake, was the White Witch. Hazel had not realized how tall she was, how oddly thin she was, like a woman made of a cold breath. She seemed almost insubstantial, and yet she emitted a force that made you want to crawl toward her. She was 100 yards away, but Hazel still felt the touch of those eyes on her. She wondered what the witch was thinking, and if she was impressed with Hazel for convincing Jack to go. The witch did not step toward them. She did not call to them. She merely stood there, completely still, the center of this desolate universe, while the air bowed to her. Next to Hazel, Jack didn't move. He looked at the White Witch, and Hazel could tell he was making a home in her gaze. The flow rocked. The water splashed at their feet. Hazel stumbled to the right, carrying Jack with her, and he still did not stop looking at the witch. "Jack," she said, her voice a hiss. "Come on now." She tugged at him, pulling him forward. "Big step now," she whispered, trying to keep her voice from shaking. She did not need to look to know the witch was standing there, perfectly erect, watching them. She could feel her presence, and Jack still could not take his eyes away. But he allowed himself to be pulled along as they lurched over the black crevice to the next flow, Hazel conscious of how clumsy she must look. They stepped, and the flow collapsed. Hazel lunged forward, feeling Jack slip out of her arms. She fell on a small piece of ice, smacking her face again. Her feet landed in the water, and a shock of cold ran through her body so intense she yelped. And then she heard another splash, a bigger one. Jack! Hazel was alone on the small patch of ice, while freshly displaced water churned next to her. Hazel scampered over to the edge of the ice just as Jack's head burst through the water, eyes popping, his breath sucking in the sky. He threw himself forward on the ice floe, and Hazel grabbed onto his left arm. "It's okay, Jack," she said, panting. "I've got you." It was only half true. In her mind, she saw herself losing her grip, saw Jack falling into the dark waters. She saw herself rescuing him from the ice only to lose him to something worse. But Jack threw his right arm on the ice, and Hazel helped him prop himself up. His face was white with shock. His chest was heaving frantically. The water had sucked away whatever warmth Hazel had given him. Hazel tugged on his arm, and Jack wriggled his way up. And then he was up and lying on the floe, shuddering, and still the witch stood there, watching. Hazel fell on top of him. Jack, are you okay?" He did not answer, only let out a small noise as chills racked his body, and Hazel tried so desperately to give him warmth, there on top of the small patch of ice while the water lapped hungrily at them. The ice meant safety now, but it could only protect itself, for the water was coming. The ice surrendered bit by bit. Pieces cracked in front of them, and the dark water burst through the cracks. On her perch, Hazel could feel the water beneath her buzzing with greedy anticipation. "Jack," she urged, "we have to go." He did not talk, did not say a word, but let her help him up. And then he froze and looked at his empty hand. "The baseball," he breathed. "Oh," said Hazel, heart plummeting. "The baseball." The baseball was gone, consumed by the black waters. It seemed like just an ordinary thing, but it was a baseball signed by Joe Mauer, and Jack had given it to her, and in that way, it was magic. "Jack, I'm sorry. We have to go. The ice is melting. Come on." She put her arms around him and led him still forward, though the ground heaved and disappeared beneath her feet. And the water roiled, and the witch watched on, and Hazel could hear the bells of her voice in her head. "Do you see now? There are things worse than the ice. Do you see what happens when it melts? Do you see what you did?" Hazel wondered what Jack was hearing. She couldn't tell. He was just a shivering shell of a boy. Hazel kept talking as they crept along. Here, step here. Be careful, don't slip. And under her words hummed the whisper, I'm here, I'm here. And then they were on the shore. Jack still said nothing, and there was nothing to do but trudge through the snow to the woods. Hazel kept her arms around Jack. He was still shuddering, and his muscles seemed only half there, like the rest of him was still on the ice. She kept pattering along. Almost there, just a little farther. She didn't know if it was helping Jack, but it gave her some distraction from the things churning inside her. And he still said nothing. And then they were from the front of the woods, and the witch was still there, still watching them, and though Hazel had survived it all, though she had Jack, hi Michael, though she was about to cross the woods to go back home, she still felt like she'd failed. All you can do, the guard at the village had said, is pretend she's not there. We're going into the woods now, Hazel whispered to Jack. We're leaving. Say something. He didn't. Hazel inhaled and stepped into the trees, and though the gaze of the witch tugged at her, she did not look back. But she wanted to. Jack's body tensed sharply as they entered the woods, and Hazel ignored it and moved on. The woods welcomed them back. There was no snowstorm, no churning sky, no assaulting cold on this side of the witch's palace. Maybe because no one had ever left before. And there, the familiar sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Hazel breathed it in. And they went. Hazel dropped her hand and Jack walked on his own, though Hazel stayed close. The sun was rising in the sky, turning the snow on the ground to slush. It was warmer now, survivable. But Jack was still shuddering, still white, like the dark water still coursed in his veins. Let's just get ahead a bit, Hazel said. It warms up soon. It turned out she didn't need the compass. It was easy to head in the other direction from the lair of the witch. All you had to do was move away from the thing pulling at you. They walked up a gentle slope, moving through the trees. They did not talk to each other, but Hazel kept glancing at Jack, making sure he was still with her. He was, but barely. He seemed so focused on making his feet move like they were supposed to. And maybe that was all he wanted to think about. Hazel wanted to ask him what he was thinking, what he was feeling, if he was regretting the witch or was just too tired to think, if he was embarrassed that the princess had rescued the knight, or if he didn't mind so much now that it had happened, if he remembered everything that had passed, if he was mad at himself for going with the witch, if his warm blood was winning the battle against the water in his veins. She wanted to reach out and grab the things in them together, and grab the things in his mind and heart and hold them so they could examine them together, but they weren't hers to take. So she led Jack along the cart path, following the sound of the clock and pulling away from the cold. The sun was being kind to Jack, warming him gently, giving him what Hazel could not. It was like they'd taken their planned trip into the woods, except then going home would have been as easy as following the breadcrumbs they'd scattered together. Hazel followed the cart path and the sounds of the clock. The journey this way was easy, though she suspected the woods could lead her wherever they chose. And they were done with her, and she was done with them. They rejoined the small footpath when the sun was near its peak in the sky and the woods was in full-on spring. The faint green smell in the air felt like an embrace. And then they entered the clearing with the clock. It was a strange thing to stand on the other end of the clearing where she'd stood at the beginning of all this. The clock was still there, but it looked smaller now and less odd, like every woods would have a skinned grandfather clock in it. Her ravens were still there, whispering to each other. One of them croaked and nodded at her from across the field, and then at the clock face. Hazel went up to look at the clock. It read 10:30. Judging by the height of the sun in the sky, that was in no way the time in the woods. The other raven trilled at her, and she got the distinct impression it was telling her she was an idiot. Hazel chewed on her lip, and then reached up and moved the clock's arms so it read 7 o'clock, and switched the picture of the sun to the moon. Maybe it would work. We're almost there, she told Jack, guiding him out of the clearing. Jack saw the wolf before she did, and he gasped and froze, pointing ahead. The wolf was just where she'd left him, standing sentry by a tree, watching out for intruders in the woods. What do we do? Jack breathed. It was the first thing he'd said since losing the baseball. It's okay, Hazel said to Jack. The wolf didn't move, only blinked and sniffed the air. She nodded at it as they passed. And then they were at the tree line, and Hazel exhaled. Jack looked at her, his brown hair as messy as always. Some things would never change. This is it, she said, because something needed to be said. That's home? Jack asked, his voice soft. Yeah, Hazel said. Jack looked at her and then back at the woods. His shoulders fell. I don't know, he said quietly. What? You don't know what? I don't know. His body twitched back toward the woods. Hazel sucked in a breath. You can't go back. I know, but he looked toward the world beyond the trees. I don't know if I can do that either. He shifted in its place. You can't stay here, she said. He gazed at her, pale face serious and searching. Why not? Hazel blinked. Because I need you, because you're my best friend, because I have to go out there too. Because it's worse in here, she said. Jack looked down. The green of the spring grass reached up to him. He took his hand and rubbed his chest just where his heart was. He shifted again. I was mean to you, he said quietly. I know, Hazel said. It was on the tip of her tongue to say, it's okay, except it wasn't, and he knew it. I don't know how to do things right sometimes. Hazel glanced to the ground. I don't either, she said. And Mom, he said, and then looked away. Hazel was supposed to say something comforting now, something that would let him know it was going to be okay, except she knew nothing of the kind. But that was still better than this. Come on, she said, and she tucked her hand through his arm. We should go home. Jack exhaled, and Hazel took that as agreement and pulled him through the trees. Hazel's foot landed in the snow, and she muttered, oh, great. She was sick of winter. It was dark out, and the air was filled with the squeals of sledding kids. It was the same scene that she had left. A great fatigue slammed into Hazel, and with terrible dread, she thought of the blocks they had to walk. They crossed the street to the sidewalk. They'd made this walk hundreds of times in their lives together. It was as familiar as air. There was so much she wanted to tell him. There had been wolves and weird psychics, swan skins and bird girls. There had been a marketplace that sold potions for forgetting, a wizard who could pull truths from your heart. There had been a cottage, a couple, a garden. There had been a match girl. There had been a journey. There was a witch who wanted nothing. And at the end of it, there was Jack. And maybe the witch was right. Maybe things wouldn't be the same. But Hazel would still do everything she could to remind him what he was made of. There was so much she wanted to tell him. It used to be that nothing really happened to her unless she told Jack about it. But they walked in silence. A minivan stopped in the street next to them, and a window rolled down to reveal the face of Tyler's mom. She called to them and motioned them into the car. Come on, I'll drive you home. Jack and Hazel exchanged a look, shrugged, and climbed in the back seat. Tyler was in the front, and he had turned fully around and was gaping at them. Hazel's hackles instinctively went up, and then she breathed them away. It wasn't going to be like that anymore. She wouldn't let it. Are you okay? Tyler whispered to Jack. Jack nodded slightly. Hazel's eyes went to the dashboard of the minivan. It read 7:10. Is it still Friday? She whispered to Tyler. He nodded, wide-eyed. His eyes were on her face now, like they could not quite take in the magnitude of her scar. Hazel's hand flew to it and traced it down the length of her cheek to her jaw. Hazel, what happened? Asked Mrs. Freeman, eyes full of alarm. That looks fresh. Did someone do that to you? Oh, said Hazel. I tripped. What was she going to tell her mom? She had to think of something. She had to get used to the question. I see, said Tyler's mom, looking dubious. And what are you doing out without your coats? Jack, I thought you were with your elderly Aunt Bernice. What? Jack said. Hazel elbowed him. He came back, said Hazel. Okay. Tyler's mom drove them the few blocks to their houses. When Hazel and Jack spilled out, Tyler was silent. His mother noticed. Aren't you going to say goodbye to your friends? Hazel heard her say as the two got out onto the sidewalk. Tyler rolled down the window and called goodbye. He started to roll up the window and then stopped. Hey, Hazel? What? You can hang out with us at recess on Monday if you want. And then he rolled up the window and they drove away, leaving Hazel and Jack standing in front of their houses. Everyone thinks you're with your Aunt Bernice, Hazel said. Jack looked at her, brown eyes wide. I don't have an Aunt Bernice, he said. A light went on in Jack's house behind them. Hazel looked up toward it and then back at Jack. Jack rubbed his hand against his chest. His mom appeared on the stoop and Jack straightened. He looked at Hazel. I should go. She nodded. Hazel? Yeah? Thanks for coming to get me. Of course. She was his best friend. Jack hesitated still, and Hazel wanted to say something comforting, give him some bright plastic flowers of words, but Jack would see them for what they were. Jack knew how to see things. Then he put his hand up and squeezed her arm and then turned toward his house. Hazel stood and watched him disappear inside. Hazel went to her own front door and walked in, breathing in the smells of home. She called for her mother, but there was no answer. Of course not. Her mom had her class. Hazel's heart sank a little. She would have liked to see her mom. She thought about going to the kitchen and getting some food, but she couldn't bear the thought of the extra movements, so she went to her room to lie down on her bed. Her stuffed animals were still there, sitting against her pillow, and Hazel lay down next to them and put her hand on the bear, then grabbed it and pulled it into her chest. She tucked in a ball on her bed. Her eyes fell on the spot where the Joe Mauer baseball used to be. Maybe she would get Jack another signed ball. It might not be easy, but it had to be easier than this. Then she noticed the wrapped present on her bedstand. She rolled over to grab it. The gift wrap was familiar, shiny purple paper that her mother had been using for 6 months. Hazel unwrapped the paper to reveal an old shoebox. She opened the box and unfolded the tissue paper inside to find a pair of pink ballet shoes. She blinked and picked up one of the shoes. There was a note in the tissue paper. Hazel, a present and a promise. Love, Mom. The writing blurred in front of Hazel's eyes. She touched the note with her fingers. She wanted to get up and leave her mom a note, but she couldn't leave the bed. So Hazel took both slippers and folded them in her arms with the teddy bear and curled back up on the bed. She could see the distant glow from Jack's house coming in the window, and she wondered what he was doing, and if he was okay, and if he'd eaten, and what he'd told his parents. She wondered what things would be like between them now, and what she was going to have to do for them to be normal again. It would be harder to watch over him if they weren't normal, but she would find a way. She wondered if she'd actually want to hang out with Tyler and Bobby at recess. Maybe a little capture the flag would do them all good? Hazel was good at capture the flag. No one took her seriously because she was small and feathered, a strange little dino bird, but she had a sickle claw and she was not afraid to use it. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Jack who got lost in the woods. His best friend went after him. Along the way, she had many adventures. She met woodsmen, witches, and wolves. She found her friend in the thrall of a queen who lived in a palace of ice and had a heart to match. She rescued him with the help of a magical object, and they returned home together, and they lived on somehow ever after. It went something like that anyway. She drifted off to sleep thinking that tomorrow she would call Adelaide and make plans to go over there. This time she would bring her own ballet shoes. She wanted to tell Adelaide and Uncle Martin all about the Snow Queen. They probably wouldn't believe her, not really. She wouldn't believe it herself. But at least it was a good story. Thank you for reading along to Breadcrumbs by Ursu with me. I hope you've had a good time. I really enjoyed the ride, getting to finish all 25 chapters with you, even though we were stuck at home and we're not going to be able to see each other. By now, you probably heard the news that we're actually not going to be able to see each other face to face until next year. Schools are officially going to be at home in Ohio for the rest of the school year, which for us is only about another 5 or 6 weeks. So until then, keep tuning in. I'm going to keep doing stuff during the day on YouTube. I'm going to keep obviously teaching you English and doing New ZLAs and stuff from home. But until then, I think I'm going to take the rest of the week off from reading while I put up a poll to decide what you guys want me to read next. I plan to keep this going until school is out for the year. So let me know if you have any suggestions. Send me a text or an email, or leave a comment. I'm definitely going to see what books I have available and what books I can get permissions from authors to read. And we should start that up again by next Monday. Okay? Join me later for a Zoom at 1 if you want to talk back about the book or if you want to talk about any questions on assignments or anything. I'll put up another video in a little while here, or I'll post in Google Classroom giving our shout outs for people who've been doing an awesome job on vocabulary. And keep in mind that I love you lots. I love you so much, and I hope you're doing okay, and I hope you're staying safe. And I hope you can't wait for the next book just like me. Until then, I'll see you. Bye.